My name is Ted, and I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. Or you can't fight City Hall, or feeding at the public trough, or one of my favorites, government employees are like nails without heads. You can get them in, but you can't get them out. These put down sayings about government make me furious. They are wrong, they are misguided, but they are in fact a true reflection of how many Americans feel about governments. So the question is, why is that? How did that come to be when several hundred years ago, our forefathers brought forth and spent a lot of time figuring out a new kind of government, not very different from the monarchies that preceded it. And for the last 200 or 300 years, we have been delighted to enjoy American democracy. We fight for it, we fiercely defend it, and yet somehow we continue today to make jokes about this institution that we fought so hard to get. So again, the question is, why is that? What is there about our society that makes it so that we don't want to have governments be the way they are? It's a very odd kind of thing. I want to talk a little bit about government and your job in changing what we have. There are three kind of misconceptions about government. The first one is, in America, we think of governments as federal or national. And Washington, D.C. is very important, and there's no question we spend a lot of time in our newspapers talking about the national government. But there are 89,000 other governments in America. These all have elected officials, 666,000 of them, by the way, non-federal elected officials. They all have taxing power. And you can see that counties are not federal, townships are not federal, cities are not federal. So there's a lot of government that goes on that has nothing to do with the federal government. And when I talk about government being good, I'm actually talking about these governments, not the federal government. The second misconception, and to make it easier for you to accept the task I'm going to ask you to do, is to imagine that governments are not politics either. Yes, in fact, with this campaign season going on, and there's signs in every neighborhood, and the airwaves are filled with various kinds of messages about politicians, it's easy to imagine that government means politics. But in fact, during the election season, that's what we think about. But in between time, somebody actually has to run the governments that are created. Somebody actually has to make sure that we do something different. Somebody has to make sure that the services are provided, that the doors are open, and in many cases, run by professional public administrators. And that's essentially what I'm going to be talking about as well today. That's how I think you can have a really deep impact on changing governments. The third misconception that we oftentimes have is that governments really aren't that important because we tend to make fun of them. But think of where you get your water and your sewer. Think about what happens when you send your kids off to the library or to the museum. Think about where obviously police and fire come from. These are provided by local governments, in fact, in most cases, by city governments. And we have all kinds of services that are provided by city governments, not federal at all, not federally funded, but just provided by 20 million Americans, 1/6 of our workforce, who work for governments at the non-federal level. So we need to think through the vital services that these governments provide, that they are vital to our lives, vital to our nation, vital to our families. And once again, I ask the question, if we have vital services provided that all of us partake in every day, why is it we think it's important to bash them? It seems like a very odd thing for us to be beating up on this institution that we all use every day. So I want to talk a little bit about your role and what you can do to change, because there are lots of things that could be done. Let me, I guess, ask a question. How many of you love the governments that you know so much that you don't want them to change? Right. So you, like me, are change agents. And that's what we need to talk about. We build our governments to not be moving by every whim and every change. We want our governments to be a little bit stable. We want them to be built in such a way that they can withstand the pressures of various things going on. The problem with that is that there aren't very many pressures for them to actually change. So one of the ways to change government is to do what they're doing in the Arab Spring. They have a really powerful thing, bullets flying, people willing to die to change their governments, as we did 250 years ago. That's not what we need to do today. Today, we're trying to give you the tools that can change governments peacefully from within. One of the ways of doing that is to know that there are, in fact, professional administrators. I started my talk by saying, I'm from the government, and I'm here to help, and my name is Ted. All that is true. I am a professional, trained, experienced city manager. I am the CEO of a municipal corporation, and 6 times in my career, in 5 different states, elected officials have appointed me to run their organization. And in fact, all the other employees work for me. So there's a hint of where you might be effective as TED people in changing government. You don't have to do it with politics, you don't have to do it with neighborhood signs, you don't have to do it even with letters to the editor necessarily. There's a professional administrator in 8,000 cities, not 19,500, but in 8,000 cities, there are professional administrators like me. I have an MBA from the Wharton Graduate School of Business. I am, in fact, in charge of a municipal corporation. You might call me the chief bureaucrat. But in fact, I actually am an entrepreneur. I am very interested in helping you change our society, change how we do business inside governments. Took a little while in my career to own and operate a company. And I did that for 14 years. And I learned all the ways that change occurs in the private sector. And that, you would think, would be one of the ways we could help change governments. But the fact is that while these driving forces work well in the private sector, and every morning I woke up being concerned about bankruptcy, every morning, and my wife did too, every morning I woke up worrying about whether or not some competitor was going to eat my lunch, whether or not I was going to have enough market share. Those things don't work in government. As a CEO of a public municipal corporation, I can't use those. I don't worry about stock prices for the city of Rancho Cordova every day. I don't worry about whether or not there's a competitor out there. None of those forces, I certainly don't worry about our market share. And until very recently, cities haven't worried about bankruptcy. That's a new twist. So these don't work to help us change governments. And it's important to know that. So now we get down to the real business. How can we change governments? I spent a lifetime learning how to do that. But I have found barriers. When I try to make change, I run up into the value systems of various communities. And I get told, we can't do that in this community. We've never done it that way. That's not what we do here. And I hear that over and over again. And I need help. It's kind of lonely at the top. If I suggest change to my staff, they say, why are we doing that? Nobody's asking for that. What are we doing that for? Why don't we just keep going the way it always has been? And so I alone cannot be the energy source for changing governments. I was delighted. I became city manager in California 60 days before Prop 13 passed 34 years ago. And I had 24 days to cut 25% out of our budget. And 3 years later, we had $20 million in the bank. And I used the cover of Prop 13 to make massive changes in our union agreements, massive changes in how we structured things, how we did our budgeting, what we did, civil service rules. All of those things became malleable under the pressure of, if you will, of Prop 13. And I milked that for 5 or 6 or 7 years, long after that. We've lost that pressure, outside pressure. And that's what we need from you. It would be very, very helpful if you would, next Monday morning, go into a city manager's office, or a school superintendent's office, or the county executive's office, and take them to lunch, or just stop in and say, we're with you. We want you to change our governments slowly and peacefully from within, rather than through some kind of revolution. It would be very helpful if I know there's somebody out there who's demanding change. I can go to the unions, I can go to the entrenched developers, I can go to the other folks that are withholding the status quo and making it so we can't move and modernize our bureaucracies. I can go to them and say, there's outside pressure from very intelligent people in this organization to make change in government. I can do that if you will make sure that next Monday you ask a county administrator or a city manager to lunch. It would be very helpful. I started by saying, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. I hope now you are here to help.